Good afternoon.
Mhm.
I'm happy to welcome Professor Greene from the King's College London. Thank you for being here with us today. ICO is at the moment interviewing leading experts in Russia and Ukraine in order to improve our understanding of what is going on there. You're the director of the Russia Institute at King's College London and professor in Russian politics. Previously, you have lived and worked in Russia for more than a decade. So at the moment, Russia has invaded Ukraine a few days ago. Intensive fighting is continuing, and most Western governments have condemned this war and have taken measures against Russia. Today, even Switzerland has joined the EU sanction regime. Are these measures effective, and which sanctions could still follow?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think we need to be clear about what kind of effects we're after. I mean, Russia has been subject to sanctions, really since the annexation of Crimea and the advent of the initial invasion of Donbass in 2014. Those sanctions, have had an effect on the Russian economy. They've raised the cost of capital. They've made it harder for Russia to invest in its economy. They've made it harder for Russia to grow, and they've contributed to a general decline and stagnation in the Russian economy. They've had an effect on isolating Russia to a degree as well, especially as those sanctions have ramped up over the years. But that's not what they were designed to do. Right? What they were designed to do was to deter Russian further interventions into Ukraine, right, and to eventually change Russian political behavior. And it's pretty clear that they haven't done that, right? The question now is, what are these sanctions designed to do? The sanctions that we've seen come in since the recognition of the separatist regions and since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And at this point, I don't think that they are designed to deter Russia. These sanctions are designed to punish Russia, to send a message that this kind of behavior will have potentially catastrophic consequences. And although most policymakers in the West won't say it out loud, I think they are designed eventually to create political change in Russia, right? To increase the costs that Putin's rule places on ordinary Russians and on Russian elites, and thus to encourage them eventually, maybe sooner, maybe later, to seek leadership that might impose fewer costs. Whether they will be successful, that only time will tell, right? We know they're having an impact on the Russian economy. We see what's happened to the ruble. We see what's happened to the financial markets. We see what is happening in terms of Russian financial and economic policy, right? Essentially, they are letting the ruble fall. They are letting financial markets fall, and they're trying to keep what is a bad situation from turning into a potentially catastrophic situation. Russia does have reserves, and they also have very sound fiscal and monetary management. But that will probably only keep things going at a reasonable rate, for a matter of months, if not less. And eventually, people start to panic, right? So we've already begun to see people queuing to get cash out of banks. That's something that they can take care of, but the more cash becomes a problem, and the more inflation sets in as a result of the declining value of the ruble and blockages of trade, I think the more difficult it's going to become for many ordinary Russians to cope with this situation.
Thank you very much. There are already strong signs that the security architecture in Europe is changing due to this conflict. Germany has recently announced to invest 100 billion euros in their military. How do you think will the future security architecture in Europe look like?
That's a fascinating question. I think the only thing that we know is it's not going to look like the one that Putin at least said that he wanted at the outset of this. Putin said he wanted a security architecture that focused on indivisible security, one of the core values at the heart of the Helsinki Agreement. He said he wanted one in which NATO played less of a role, and obviously one in which Russia plays more of a role. Right. Of course, I think there's a difference between what he says and what he may actually want. I think that Russia has, under Putin's leadership, consistently over the last several years tried to actually create and cement confrontation with Europe and with the West in general. This is done primarily for domestic political reasons. We can talk about that, but it's he has since 2008 and 2014 used his military, but also special services and economics and politics in general to sort of draw and defend lines on the map of Europe. And he seems to feel politically more comfortable in a situation of confrontation. Right? That's not a place where Europe, and particularly the European Union, feels comfortable. Right? The European Union doesn't like to think of itself as a geopolitical entity. It thinks of itself as economic and as providing prosperity to everybody, including countries on the other side of its border. And it has had, as a result of what happened in Crimea, and now as a result of what's happening in Ukraine, to learn to think of itself in much more geopolitical terms and to understand the security implications, even of simply concluding deep and comprehensive free trade agreements with other countries. That this can, in certain circumstances, provoke a conflict, and that means that Europe has to decide, right? How, if Russia is willing to put its military, right, and the force of its state on the European border, right, what is Europe prepared to put on its side of the border? And in particular, how important is it to Europe to see that the countries currently between the EU and Russia, so that's Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, also the South Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, how important is it to Brussels and to the 27 member states that those countries eventually come to integrate with Europe and begin to become governed economically and maybe politically more like Europe and less like Russia? Because Moscow is clearly willing to fight to keep those countries governed in a way that more closely resembles and is more compatible with the way that Moscow governs its politics and its markets. Europe is going to have to decide whether they are willing to cede those countries essentially to Moscow, or whether they are willing to fight for them, not necessarily militarily, right? But in other ways.
Thank you. There are certain signs that as well the Russian advance into Ukrainian territory is not as fast as it was expected probably by Russian leaders. What do you think are the strategic goals in this conflict, in particular in this military conflict?
That's a question I'm having a really hard time answering, right? Because from my perspective, and like most political scientists, I begin with a degree of an assumption around rational actors, right? From my perspective, looking at rationality, this war didn't make sense, right? It's very hard to see how this war could create anything but risks and loss for Putin, unless it would have gone, perfectly well. But even if you imagine, say the best case scenario for Putin, right? So that he, captured Kiev in a couple of days and took Zelensky out of power and installed a government that was more friendly to Moscow. It's impossible to imagine that that's a government that could actually be sustainable in Ukraine, right? That it could have any kind of legitimacy and could manage the country. It's a government that would be likely to fall unless it has significant military, frankly, support from Russia to stay in power. And it's not clear that Russia would actually be able to provide that kind of support across the country. So It does seem clear, yes, that the military objectives are to take key cities, particularly Kyiv, Kharkiv, to provide a buffer around Crimea in the south. But if you take Putin at his word that his goal is, as he put it, the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, then that means regime change, right? So you have to decapitate the regime and put something else in power. And you're right? It does not seem to be going as well as we think he would have hoped, right? The indications that we get from intelligence, at least, and from most of the military and security analysts, is that this looks like it was an operation that was designed to achieve success very quickly, but didn't quite understand and wasn't quite organized the right way to actually achieve that.
Thank you. You have written a book called Putin versus the People, Perilous Politics of a Divided Russia, together with Professor Robertson. Mm-hmm. What do people in Russia really think about Putin's war, according to your assessment?
Well, again, we don't really know, right? We saw polls consistently over the last several years and up as recently as the very beginning of this year, showing some contradictory things. Right. So we see that a majority of Russians essentially, express support for Putin and broadly support for his foreign policies, almost regardless of what those policies are. They don't get into the details. They're not that interested in the details. It's a minority of people who are interested in the details. At the same time, despite the fact that Russia has essentially been at war with Ukraine on a lower scale for the last 8 years, and despite the amount of essentially propaganda that Russian state TV has put out to ordinary Russians about what's going on in Ukraine, that never succeeded in building a majority of Russian citizens who were angry at Ukraine, right, or who were in support of a war, or indeed of some of the ideas that Putin has talked about publicly in terms of essentially Ukraine being artificial and needing somehow to return to Russia. Most Russians have consistently over the last 8 years felt that that Russia should be aiming for friendly relations with Ukraine. And in a poll just earlier this year, in fact, from the Public Opinion Foundation, a pollster that's quite loyal to the Kremlin, they found that relations with Ukraine are ranked as the single biggest policy failure, right, of Putin's foreign policy in recent years, together with relations with the West and sanctions. It's very difficult to say what the actual level of support or opposition for this war is, right? But it's clear that they have not produced anything like the kind of rally around the flag, right, that they had after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. We have seen consistent anti-war protest across the country, not just in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but in something like 60 cities across the country. We have somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 people who have been arrested at these protests over the last 3 days. And the protests aren't showing much sign of slowing down despite that level of repression. Right? It's not hundreds of thousands of people, right? It's not millions of people. It does not necessarily represent a majority, right? But it's striking that we are seeing those protests and we are not seeing any kinds of rallies in support of the war.
Is Russian propaganda effective in convincing people that in Ukraine there is a Nazi regime in power, or because they were talking about denazification and as well think about the possibility that Ukraine could nuclearly arm itself again?
Again, we don't have a lot of good data on that, but the reality is that the majority of Russians still get their news from state television, right? And this is the message that's been consistently on state television for years. there's a couple of things, right? One of which is that Russians are not naive, broadly speaking, right? Certainly not more or less naive than people in other countries, and they're aware that they get lied to on television, and they're aware that the government lies to them. When it comes to news about the economy or about things happening inside Russia itself, they're usually pretty good at seeing through those lies. When it comes to news about foreign affairs and things happening outside of Russia's borders, they're usually more ready to believe what they're being told on television. So that would suggest, right, that a lot of people, and anecdotally, we're hearing this from a lot of people, right, particularly friends and colleagues who talk to their relatives who are maybe less likely to, particularly older relatives who are maybe less likely to use the internet to get independent information. That yes, a lot of people do buy into these lines about fascism and about nuclear armaments and things like that, about American bases in Ukraine or whatever it is that Putin's talking about on any given day. But at the same time, again, that's not translating into anger, and it's not translating into fear of Ukraine. Right? So it may be that because Ukraine is so familiar to people, right? This is not Syria. It's not even Chechnya, right, where most Russians have never gone and will never go. Tens of millions of Russians have Ukrainian heritage. Tens of millions of Russians have friends and family living in Ukraine. They've been to Ukraine. They've been to, some of them were even born in the cities that they're now seeing, or that we are now seeing being bombed on television. The issue, of course, is that they're not seeing it being bombed on television.
Thank you. I know that it's always hard to make predictions, especially if we have so little information as right now. But how could the future scenario look like? How could Russia leave this standoff with the West?
Well, so I mean, just before we sat down to have this conversation, right, there were discussions on the border of Ukraine and Belarus. They did not yield anything, at least not that we're aware of, but they also didn't break down. Both sides have returned to their capitals and essentially are considering, right, the possibility of having a second and possibly further rounds of discussions. So it's possible that one way out of this, right, is some kind of negotiated solution that would allow Putin to declare some kind of a victory without achieving the regime change that he is obviously hoping to achieve. If, however, so put it that way, that would be the best case scenario. And in fact, that's the only scenario I can imagine in which we don't end up with significantly greater loss both for Russia and for Ukraine. If Russia decides that that's not something they can accept, and they decide to press forward with this war, it is already creating much greater civilian casualties and destruction in Kyiv and Kharkiv and in other places in Ukraine. And it will also create catastrophic losses to the Russian economy and to Russian society. And it is impossible for me to imagine how Putin himself or Russia as a whole emerges from that as a winner, right? As anything other than severely damaged and diminished. Unfortunately, at the moment, that's just about as far as I think I can go in terms of predicting the future. War is inherently a very uncertain thing.
Thank you very much for your time, Professor Greene. Would you like to add any additional point in regards to the current situation?
No, I think you've been pretty thorough with the questions. I would just say it's important, obviously, to be paying a lot of attention to voices on the ground. Right, it is very, very difficult to get reliable information right now about what's happening either in Ukraine or in Russia. So while I'm perfectly happy to continue to contribute to these sorts of conversations from my vantage point here right now in the U.S., I think it's actually more important that we be listening to people who actually have access to the societies that are going through this crisis.
Thank you. I think you have shared a lot of interesting insights and information with us today.
Thank you.